forward to what we have to look at throughout our Monday, Wednesday, and Friday devotional times together. This week, we're going to be looking at the book Misquoted. It is a book that I mentioned in my list of things that you guys could be reading during this quarantine time. It is a book by Dan Seitzel, and what it is really is it's just a book that takes some common verses that we have often misquoted and taken them out of their biblical context and have made them mean something that the Bible never originally intended them to mean. And so what we're going to be looking at this week is we're going to take this book and I'm going to show you how it works. I'm going to be using the verse in here, Romans 8:28, and we're going to be looking at how this book takes each verse that it goes through and it identifies the false claim that people often give the verse to mean. And then on Wednesday, we'll be looking at the correct context for the verse. And then Friday, during our Friday night series podcast, we'll be looking at the consider the comfort and why it is so much better when we take the Bible and read it in its proper context and get the true meaning of the verse. So this is the book Misquoted by Dan Seitzel. If you want to look it up on Amazon and pick it up for a read. But if you have a Bible, I would invite you to turn to Romans chapter 8. And this is a really interesting verse, and is a really good verse that a lot of the times people take it right out of context. And we're going to be looking at that false context today here, Monday. And then on Wednesday, we will be looking at the correct context for the verse. So Romans 8:28, if you have a Bible, follow along. It says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." Read that one more time. "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." The title of this chapter is really kind of the false context that we associate with this verse, and that is everything happens for a reason. Everything happens for a reason, and everything is going to turn out good. And we're going to look at the section called Consider the Claim, where Dan is going to tell us a little bit of an anecdote from his own experience and how this verse is kind of misquoted. Use the title. There we go. All right, here we go. Consider the Claim. "One of the most difficult funerals I, Dan, have ever had to perform was for a man who had killed himself. I received a phone call right before our little parochial school's chapel service one Wednesday. I listened as the new widow cried her pain into the telephone, beside herself with grief, and I was just dumbfounded as she was. Her husband's suicide was a shock to everyone who knew him. Certain kinds of tragedy elicit unique sorts of grief. When a child or young person is killed suddenly or is diagnosed with a terminal illness, it creates a different kind of mourning than when a 93-year-old grandma dies in her sleep. Another sort of grief hits us like a tidal wave when someone we love takes their own life, and that grief is saturated with the question, why? That is not to say that such a question is absent from other kinds of suffering. However, the difference is that unlike the child dying or the young mother getting in the fatal car accident, with suicide, there's ultimately no answer to the question, and there is nothing that can be done about the situation. At least when someone is killed by a drunk driver, we can point at the drunk driver and say, this happens because you made a really bad choice, and now you must suffer the consequences. We may not know why a child is diagnosed with cancer, but at least we have medical professionals that we can point to and say, help us fight this with everything we have. We retain at least a model bit of control over the situation. But with suicide, it is different. While we can try to sort through a person's past and psychoanalyze his personality and piece together a reason why, at the end of the day, all the answers to that question remain locked up in the mind of the one who took his own life. It is not surprising that the friends and loved ones so often fill in the blanks by asking, what could I have done that might have prevented this? It is a way of grasping for control. It is ultimately a search to answer the question, why? Unfortunately, one of the most common questions that well-meaning Christians give in the face of such tragedy is to say everything happens for a reason. It's an attempt to give comfort, to help the grieving to look to the future in hope, to promise that somehow what seems senseless now will one day make sense. Give it enough time and prayer, and it will eventually become clear what God is up to in this tragedy. These were some of the things in which the family sought to find comfort after the husband, father, brother, uncle, and friend had taken his own life. For the funeral, the family and I agreed that one of the sons would read the obituary before the service started. What he chose to do instead, much to my surprise, was offer the congregation some thoughts to consider. Many of you here today might be wondering the same thing that we've wondered much in these past weeks. You're probably wondering why this happened. And then looking up from his notes, he firmly and passionately said, "Let me tell you something. We don't care why." The son proceeded to speak about how wonderful and loving his dad was, which by all accounts he was. But the passion with which he spoke, the calculated fervency with which he uttered those words, "We don't care why," betrayed the fact that he cared very much why his dad did this, but he could not find an answer. Now he searched long and hard for one. As he continued, he said something that grabbed my attention. He spoke about how, because this thing had happened, as terrible as it was, it had brought the family and friends together. It had created an opportunity to remember Dad and his love and how full of life he had lived. Of course, such platitudes are hard-pressed to silence the nagging reality that the reason we had all gathered was precisely because the life had ended in an incredibly horrific way. Well, he did not say it outright. The son basically told us that everything happens for a reason. And the reason it all happened was to bring us all together. That was it. He had discovered the ounce of control that he could have in the situation. That was the best answer he could muster. That was supposed to be a comfort for all that were gathered there. Our coming together with fond memories was somehow supposed to justify the horrible death of this brother in Christ. And why shouldn't he say that? After all things work together for good, right? Those words are straight from the Bible, and they are often spoken in situations just like this one I have recounted above. However, Romans 8:28 is a verse that when spoken in a certain context actually becomes vapid and trite. It's one of those verses that well-meaning Christians can rattle off as it fixes everything. Are you suffering? Well, don't worry. For those who love God, all things work together for good. Everything happens for a reason, right? But releasing those words flippantly into the suffering of another person without understanding and proclaiming their context is one of the most unhelpful things a person can do. Okay, so that whole anecdote there was just to explain a situation where the son of the man who took his own life basically gained control in that situation by saying everything happens for a reason, and because of what happened, our family gathered together. And this man's point, Dan's point, is that apart from its context, it can actually be very harmful to tell people that everything happens for a reason when something horrible happens. It's just one of those things that we throw out there as Christians. We're like, you know what? Romans 8:28, you love God, everything happens for a reason. Some good will come out of the situation. And unfortunately, that is often misguided, and it doesn't really help the situation. So that is the false claim for Romans 8:28 that maybe you guys had said, maybe some of you had thought that is what this verse is all about, to help us explain things that are hard. Everything happens for a reason. But that is not what the Bible is getting at. And on Wednesday, we're going to be looking at the correct context in which to interpret this verse. And then Friday, we will be looking at the comfort that comes from interpreting the Bible correctly. Hopefully, you guys have a good day. Hopefully, you enjoy this book, Misquoted. If you really like this, you can pick it up. I got this. I think I bought this at Kennedy Parables in Red Deer. You can get it online. It is a good little tool to just kind of get a grasp on some of the most famous verses that we rattle off, sometimes in the wrong context. But that's all I have for you this morning. We'll see you on Wednesday.